Yo, what up, everybody? It's Dizzler back with another video. Before we get into this, read aloud or whatever you want to call it, I have a little bit of a question or a request for you guys. Go ahead and comment down your favorite bleach waifu. Personally, I'd love for you guys to do that. I like Candace Catnip. I like this bitch right here, Tatsuki. You tell me that, and also feel free to comment between these two which ones you want. What if Naruto's enslaved, or what if Naruto had Thor's powers? They're both would be a remake. One with the most likes, I will maybe do, maybe possibly. If it depends on my mood, but yeah. Without further ado, let's hop in the video. Beheaded, yeah. Ichigo stood silently in the street where Rukia had just faded before his eyes, only a few weeks before, as he had lost his powers. He reached up with his free hand and scratched his rough face, his short facial hair like sandpaper against his hand. He felt the slightly chilly breeze against his skin as he stood in only his t-shirt and blue jeans, his hand in his pocket. He closed his eyes and laughed softly to himself. I just wanted to be normal, he thought as he looked up at the sky above him. Now that I am, all that I want to do is be something more. How pathetic of me. As he stood lost in his own thoughts, he felt the uneasy sensation of being watched. He broke from his trance and began to look around for the source of his uneasiness. He'd felt the prying eyes boring into him, but for the life of him, he couldn't find the source. As he looked around one more time, he caught a movement out of the corner of his eye and turned to see Tatsuki in a jacket and heavier pants walking up to him. He saw the look of recognition on her face as she approached him, and he turned his back on her, standing silently where he was. "Hey," she said softly, stopping next to him and looking at him. "What are you doing out here without a jacket or something? You'll catch a cold, you dumbass." "Nothing," he said coldly, closing his eyes, turning away from her. "Why do you care?" "I don't," she scoffed, turning her back to him and crossing her arms. "But Orihime would be upset if you were to get sick, and she'd be very worried about you. So if you're not going to do it for your own sake, then for hers. Go get something warm on." Yeah, he said, annoyed as he waved his hand at her, dismissively over his shoulder. "Just go home or something. What are you even doing around this side of the town, anyway? The dojo's nowhere near here, and you don't live this way either, nor does anyone I've seen you hang out with, so there's no real reason for you to be out this way. Can't a girl just go out for a damned walk without people wanting to know her life story?" she said, her anger boiling up as she clenched her fists. "Besides, how do you know none of my friends live around here? You don't know all of my friends, clearly." Ichigo rolled his eyes before turning and walking back towards his house. "All right," he said, resigning the fight before he left. "Have a good walk or whatever. I'm going home." With a wave of his shoulder, he continued back to his house, the uneasy sensation of being watched long forgotten due to his conversation with Tatsuki. As he walked away, Tatsuki turned her back and began walking again. She continued. She made a circle around the block and was now headed back the way she'd come. Just on the other side of the block, she watched the river flying by, walking back to her house all the way across town. As she walked alongside the river, she felt the memories of years ago flooding through her mind. Tatsuki Arasawa had just finished sparring with the pathetic little wimpy Strawberry and was so proud she'd beaten him, throwing her hands in the air in her victory. She watched as the boy cried aloud before suddenly his mother walked in the door and he was done crying and grinning like an idiot, and soon ran into her arms within seconds. She smiled her beautiful smile at her son and checked to make sure he was alright before taking his hands and waving goodbye to the dojo as they began walking out. As she realized now might be her only chance to ask, Tatsuki ran over to Ichigo and grabbed him by the coat, holding on so he couldn't leave. "Hey, Tatsuki," he said with a smile. "What's up?" "It's just," she said, Not sure whether she really wanted to admit it. He was her only friend here, and not sure she really wanted to invite him, but she knew it was true. Well, would you come over to my birthday party next week? Sure, he said with an even bigger smile, which seemed impossible to her. Totsky smiled back at him, surprise causing her to give out an excited yelp as she hugged him, and he laughed off the initial he gave out as she wrapped him up. She suddenly couldn't wait until her birthday. She had invited her best friend over, and her parents had tons of cool things ready for them to do. She didn't care that he was the only friend she'd have over, because he was the only friend she needed. The next week seemed to her like it couldn't go by fast enough, but it flew by in reality. As the day neared, she heard weather reports saying that there was to be a large rainstorm on her birthday. And all she could hope for was that the weather would not deter her best friend from showing up. She was still ecstatically waiting for her birthday, and when she woke up and looked out the window, even the depressing rainstorm couldn't extinguish her excitement. She helped her mother clean the house for the guest and helped make lunch for when he was supposed to arrive, and she even laid her favorite toys and games on for him to be impressed for when he got there. The day pressed on, and slowly ticking by the hours as she eagerly watched the door for any sign of her friend's arrival. She even ran to the window any time people drove near enough for the house to her to think that it might be him. As it got late and dinner time swung around, she resolved that he might not be coming and, sadly, put away all of her things and went to her room, not going to the kitchen for her cake or birthday dinner, but sitting in her room, holding her legs tight to her chest as she began to cry. She heard the telephone ringing and the den of her mother picking up. After a few moments of inaudible conversation, she heard her mother put the phone back down on the receiver and knock on the door. Go away, she said between sobs. I don't want to see anyone right now. Sweetie, there's something I need to tell you about Ichigo, her mother said in a soft tone. Tatsuki stood and unlocked her door, wiping her eyes as a small bit of light entered the room with the hallway. I don't care about him, Tatsuki said as she sniffled and tried to regulate her breathing. He's not my friend. I hate him. I never want to see him again. Tatsuki, her mother said gently as she picked her daughter up in her arms. Masaki and Ichigo were found on the riverbank. Tatsuki's eyes widened as she realized what her mother was telling her. Fresh tears began to dwell as she could barely hold in her sobs as her mother held her closer. Ichigo's? She couldn't even bring herself to think it, much less say it. No, her mother answered. He's not dead. His mother, however, was not so fortunate. The police don't know who or what killed her, but she was dead lying defensively over Ichigo. All I ask is that you find it in your heart to understand and help him through this difficult time of life. Tatsuki looked up at her mother and sobbed, a yes at her as she continued crying. Not for herself any longer, but for her friend. Tatsuki stood beside the riverbank she'd seen him sitting at all alone so many times. She'd never been able to find the courage to go up and ask him how he was doing, but so many nights she found him standing on that bank, searching for her. So many times she'd seen him curled up on the ground in the exact place where his mother had died, protecting him, sobbing softly. In the months following his mother's demise, Ichigo changed, and she noticed. He stopped going to karate training. He would wander in the streets alone all day, sometimes getting caught by lowlifes that would tease him for his hair color. His temper had gotten shorter and he began to get into fights with these kids, often getting his ass handed to him and walking home with more bruises and cuts each time. As the years pressed on, his demeanor became colder and colder, his attitude just as shady as the thugs he'd beat up for being dishonorable pieces of shit just like he appeared to be. Tatsuki had always seen through it, but had known, all this time, to let him have his space as he desired. Through middle school, she saw him getting in so many fights, and she swore he did it just for the hell of it. Every time she saw him as they crossed paths, and he was covered in bruises and cuts, she couldn't help but feel the pang of sadness and desire to protect him. After seeing him with a broken shoulder from one of his fights in their first year of middle school, she walked up to him and asked him what had happened, but he coldly turned away from her, telling her it was nothing and proceeding on his way. From that day on, she forced herself to work hard to keep from worrying about him. She had to be just as cold as him, as he was to her, so he would realize what a great friend he'd lost with his attitude. More years had passed of her forcing herself not to care about him, as him being a low-life scrapper, and eventually their ties had almost been completely severed. She'd ceased to care about him and his constant fighting and his injuries, and she had her own life with her own new best friend. The problem was, this best friend, while having lost her brother, being new to the school, had developed a huge crush on Ichigo, and Tatsuki couldn't help but be annoyed by her circumstances. But, of course, despite that, Hime was still her best friend, and she couldn't let that change just because she was angry with the strawberry for all of his years of coldness towards her, when all she wanted to do was help him. They transitioned through middle school and into high school, and in fact, their first year, something changed within Ichigo. Numerous times he'd begun to act funny, and she noticed his many absences, along with the absences of her friends and a couple of her other students. Now, after nearly 2.5 years of high school, they were there. She'd learned of his entire life as a Shinigami, seen him stand up to the most powerful man she'd ever seen. As she found out throughout that time, where he and her friends disappeared often for long periods of time, that her feelings of concern and sadness for her friends had never truly vanished. She'd just been suppressing them until she no longer felt them. Now, they were there, and they were stronger than ever. She stared over at the glimmering water of the river and sighed deeply as her thoughts rushed. She was sitting on the bench that overlooked the waters as she sighed, slightly sad at her thoughts and memories. She allowed her head to fall backwards and over the back of the bench. She opened her eyes and nearly had a heart attack as she found herself staring right at Ichigo. "It's beautiful here," he said nonchalantly. "Wouldn't you agree?" He cast his eyes upon her. Yeah, I guess," she stuttered as she straightened on the bench and twiddled her thumbs, blushing slightly for some reason unknown to her. Ichigo took a seat next to her and stared at the water, still not in something warm, she noticed, annoyed. "So, what are you really doing out here?" he asked, not looking at her. "Just going for a walk," she said defensively. "I don't have to explain myself to you." Ichigo nodded and continued looking out over the water silently, as she sat there thinking about these past few years and months and how he hadn't told her anything. She began to feel enraged. She felt betrayed that he and her best friend couldn't even trust her enough to fill her in on what was going on. She felt hurt deeply that he would hide more from her, and she found herself worrying about him, like she did after his mother had died. "So," she said, trying to think of something to say. "So," he said, unsure of how to respond. "How's life been treating you?" "Fine," she said, twiddling her thumb some more. "And yours?" As soon as she said it, she regretted it, knowing he'd lost his powers. He said, shrugging and still not meeting her gaze. "It's still going. Nothing really I can complain about. I made my choices consciously, and now I'm paying the price for them." "How?" she asked, unsure, hurt that he would suggest that anything of what he was going through was fair. "What choices did you make that cost this much?" "Tatsuki," he began. "No!" she screamed, standing up, lightning fast on the verge of tears. "That's bullshit and you know it. You don't deserve any of this." He turned and looked at her for the first time since the conversation began as she stood up. "Tats," he said, soothingly, "come here and sit down." Tatsuki's fists were balled up so tight her knuckles were snow white. Her body shook with anger and sadness, and she tried to hold back but found that she couldn't. Without thinking, she cocked back and punched him across the face. "Ow!" he shouted as the force knocked him back to the ground as he clutched his face. "What the hell? What?" Tatsuki's eyes watered and tears streamed down her face as she stood above him. "Tatsuki," he said, slowly standing up before her. "No, Ichigo," she said, pushing him away as he couldn't console her. "It's not fair, and you're never going to be upset about it, so someone has to be upset for you. All you can do is be the tough guy who has to carry on all the world's burdens on his shoulders. God forbid you actually let your own feelings and emotions matter sometimes." He watched her screaming at him, shakily with her anger and sadness as the tears streamed down her face. and he cast his eyes down. "I'm sorry," he said, turning his back to her, yet again and beginning to walk back home. "God damn it!" she screamed after him. "There you go again! You can't even show how simple fucking emotion or anything. When I just clocked you in the jaw, for God's sake. Ichigo, just be upset or something. I mean, none of what you've been through is fair. Yet you just keep bearing it like it's your own cross." "Because it is my cross," he said, just loudly enough for her to hear. "I have chosen the life I lead, and I made it what it is, and myself what I am today. There's no going back, so there's no point in being upset over it." "If you don't want to go back, that's fine," she said, still standing over there, angrily shaking as the tears dried up on her cheeks. "But just tell me why." Ichigo's brows furrowed as he was genuinely confused by her words now. "Why what?" he asked, turning to face her. "Why didn't you talk to me?" she asked, her knees becoming weak as she stepped towards him, slowly closing the distance. "Why you ignored me after your mother died? I just wanted to help you through it. Why you lied to me about all those fights and the injuries you got from them? Like that broken arm." "I didn't talk to anyone about any of that," he said, slightly annoyed. "But you were my best friend before she died," Tatsuki said softly, staring at him with fresh tears streaming down her gentle features. "You could have talked to me, and you just didn't." He could feel the hurt in her words. He didn't know what to say, so he stayed silent, his back to her as she continued approaching him. "Why didn't you tell me when you became a Shinigami?" she sobbed out. "Why didn't you fucking tell me where Orihime was when she disappeared? I blamed you and said so many awful things to you." "I didn't want you to get involved, so you wouldn't get hurt," he said softly. Tatsuki finally reached him and collapsed to her knees behind him as she clung to the back of his shirt for support. "I was so worried about you all this time," she said softly, clinging to his shirt as she sobbed. "Didn't that matter to you at all?" Ichigo's eyes widened slightly as he heard this. He turned to face her and knelt down before her and hugging her. "I'm so truly sorry," he said, holding her head to his heart, while he rested his chin on top of her head and her eyes widened in shock. "I'm so sorry. I never knew how much it hurt you. From now on, though, I'll always keep you in the loop. I'm sorry for being such a terrible friend." Her eyes watered again, even heavier than before, as she clung to him like her life depended on it. As they sat there, she felt the years of worry and sadness and pain flowing out through her tears, as she now knew that he is truly, and always was, her best friend. Alright, thank you guys for making it all the way to the end of the video. Make sure to like, subscribe, turn on post notifications if you enjoyed that. That's chapter 1. The author of this will have a link down in the description below, or at least the story where I found it. If you guys want me to narrate more, it has 9 chapters. To the best of my knowledge, I will be more than willing to. After all, I find this quite an interesting story. Yeah, thanks for the support. Make sure to leave a comment below. I help push this in the algorithm, and yeah, I'm out.